Welcome to Access the Podquest. This is a special introduction to an episode that you are going to be seeing shortly, an interview that we're having with author Larry Gottlieb. I want to give a little introduction because it's going to watch this. You're going to need a little bit of background on some of the details that we're talking about. We're talking about what's known as the observer effect and consciousness and things in that nature. And the observer effect, especially, is really related to, or at least well known, in the quantum world, not in the larger world, but the quantum world. And by quantum world, I mean the things that are really small, subatomic particles. You break everything down. I use the pen a lot, so I'm going to use it now. You take the pen, you break it all the way down to its constituent parts. You're eventually going to get to atoms, and then below atoms, you're going to keep going, and you're going to get to electrons and neutrons and protons, and even further down below that, leptons, etc. But if you take an electron, for example, everyone knows pretty much what that is. That's a subatomic particle, and it is subject to what is known as quantum weirdness, all right, which is a remarkably difficult thing for us in the larger non-quantum world to understand. By quantum, I mean subatomic particles. All right? So, and there are a lot of things that a lot of different aspects and a lot of different points of what's known as quantum weirdness. But the one I want to focus on today, the one that's important for our conversation, is what's known as quantum superposition. What that says, what that's about is if you take an electron, it's absolutely confirmed. It's not like it's subject to controversy, but you take the electron and it is not in one particular state of existence. It's in what's known as a superposition of all possible states. And it's just a remarkably unusual thing. The only time it stops being in a superposition of all possible states is when it is observed, or maybe when it interacts with something else. So, and most people will at least have some familiarity with this concept if they're familiar with what's known as the double slit experiment. Very famous experiment in which, and I drew it out on the back of one of these papers. Here's the paper. And these are the two slits, okay? And if you are an experimenter, a scientist, and you're shooting photons, just electrons or photons or whatever subatomic particle of your choice at this paper, and it had two slits in it, here's the thing. If no one is observing it, if there's no one watching it from the outside, the electron or the photon will go through both slits at the same time. Seemingly impossible, but that's the case. One photon shot here goes through both slits at the same time. However, if you put someone standing there watching it now, the photon goes through only one slit at a time. That seems to be almost impossible. Why would it matter, right? If someone's watching it, why would it matter if someone's observing the actual act of the photon or electron passing through either one or both slits? But it does matter. It matters fundamentally because if no one's watching, both slits. If one's watching, if someone is watching, only one slit. And really what that elaborating on that, what happens is if you take the electron or the photon and you observe it, if you keep it isolated, it just remains in a fuzzy, non-real situation of superposition. But if you actually look at it or you measure it, which is now known as the measurement problem, if you measure it, if you look at it, it suddenly snaps out of that superposition of all possible states, snaps into reality as one thing. It's absolutely mind-bogglingly weird, but that's part of quantum weirdness. And as mind-boggling as that is, we're going to be talking to Larry Gottlieb in just a few minutes here. And Larry's got some ideas that really broaden it out a lot further, because what he's saying is that you can take the same kind of concepts and apply it to the macro world, the larger world, the thing of pens and people and microphones and paper and whatnot. He's saying consciousness is the substrate of everything. And from there, the observer effect can take over, and consciousness creates reality. So stay tuned and get ready for Larry Gottlieb on Access the Podquest as we go ever forward. All right, welcome back to Exodus, the PodQuest. Today is an exciting day. We have with us a great guest. His name is Larry Gottlieb. He is an author, podcaster, and deep thinker focused on challenging conventional beliefs and exploring consciousness. Larry is the author of two books. One is The Seer's Explanation, published in 2013, and then also Hoodwinked, which is published in 2021. His website is aptly named www.larrygottlieb.com. So everyone taking a look at this, go and check out that website and see what Larry is about. You're going to learn a lot more about what that is today as we talk to him. Right now, I'd like to welcome you, Larry, to the show. Welcome to Access the Podcast.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Very good. All right, so Larry, I got introduced to your name and your subject matter through your website, and specifically through a blog entry that you had. And I'd like right now just to start us off by reading that blog entry. It's not very long, but it's really insightful. I really love this, and then we can jump off and have our conversation about it. Okay? So here we go. The blog entry is entitled, and by the way, everybody, again, this is on LarryGottlieb.com. You can go check that out. The blog entry is entitled "The Observer Effect in the Context of Consciousness," and here it is. How then does the observer effect show up when the world of objects is recognized to be the result of an interpretive process? The default or classical understanding of the observer effect is that the phenomenon of changing the situation from the way it was before observed to something different. But when the world and all its components are viewed as the result of interpretation by the observer effect is no longer an agent of change, but rather an agent of creation. The observer brings the world that he or she is experiencing into being through interpretation. There is no situation prior to its observation, and therefore there can be no effect on the situation in the usual sense. This inversion of the relationship between the world and the observer has numerous benefits. Psychologically, it puts the observer in a position of personal power with respect to the world of one's experiences, which is unavailable in the classical view. Most of us have found that the changing world is difficult at best. However, interpretations can be changed or replaced, and thus the world as a product of interpretation can be changed as well. Right? That's the entire blog entry. I found it was absolutely fascinating. Let me ask you, based on that, this is just a top-down question, and it's one we've all heard of before. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around to hear it or see it, does it make a sound, make a sight? What do you say?
Well, you have to define terms, Brian. I think the word sound points to an experience. And without an observer, there is no experience. If you define sound as vibrations in the air, yes, a tree falling in the forest creates vibrations in the air. But vibrations are not the same thing as sound. You need an interpretive layer to turn vibrations into sound.
And that would that apply though also if there were observers other than human beings, for instance, a deer, any type of animal that might be around. When the tree falls, it makes would it make a sound as defined as you just defined it because the deer would hear it?
Well, the deer has uh, circuitry like we do that would turn the vibrations that in the air that are hitting its eardrum, it would turn that into some kind of an experience. I don't know what experience is for a deer. I don't know what that looks like, but it would certainly trigger the animal to pay attention or run or, just the same way vibrations in our environment would trigger some reaction on our part.
Okay. Is it similar to the idea that is what you're saying similar to the idea that, if something appears to have a particular color, the color itself might not exist in reality as a color until somebody looks at it through their eyes and all the mechanisms that attach to the brain, etc., that then interpret it to be red or green or blue or something along those lines.
Yeah, color is an experience. And you can talk about the physics of color. You can talk about the fact that white light hits an object which absorbs everything but red, whereas it reflects red, what we call the frequency that corresponds to red. And when that frequency of light hits our interpretive mechanisms, we have the experience of red.
Hmm. Yeah, and if we don't have somebody who's observing that, there's nobody to absorb those waves or whatever it might be that is out there that could be interpreted as red, then there is no actual color. It just stays as what it is without that interpretive process. Is that
I think
effectively
that's
the
right.
idea?
I think
Okay.
that's right. I think color is an experience, and without an observer, there's no experience.
So if there was no one on the planet, or there's no living beings on the planet, except for maybe vegetation, let's say, a bush that might otherwise look like it would be green to us, just simply wouldn't have an actual color. It would just be what it is, and until something comes along and looks at it, right?
Presumably.
Okay.
You're
And
delving
I'm
into an interesting question there. I like your reference to if a tree falls in the forest. The one I like is if all sentient creatures were to disappear, would there still be a planet revolving around a star? And
right.
I don't think you could make that leap because planet is an interpretation of mostly visible light, but also other frequencies of light. It's an interpretation, not a thing until it's observed.
Okay, so that kind of connects to one of the points I wanted to raise kind of early on here, and that is the work of Robert Lanza, who is a scientist mostly associated, well, associated with a lot of different things. He's a very well known guy, but he's also most recently tied with what he's referring to as biocentrism. Is that something you're familiar with? Do you know about that?
Only because you drew my attention to it, Brian, and I looked it up on Wikipedia
Okay.
so I could respond to you.
Yeah, what do you think of his idea? Well, let me kind of summarize briefly. Robert Lanza's ideas takes your point about the planet and the moon. Let's say if there's no one there to observe it, is there really a planet? He affirmatively is saying in his biocentrism thesis that there is no planet, there is no moon, there is no anything. The universe simply doesn't exist out there separately until it's observed by sentient being, or perhaps even maybe not sentient. I don't know want to speak for him on that, but at least until it's observed, it simply doesn't exist. Are you kind of going in that same direction? Is that something that aligns with your thinking?
Yeah, I'm going in that direction. It aligns with my thinking. There is something that we are perceiving. Uh, uh, there is a world. I mean, we're not creating all this in our imagination. There is a world, but we don't have direct access to it. We have an interpretive mechanism. We have an explanation of the signals that our senses receive and transmit to our brains, and our brains make pictures from those signals, much like a television set does. And uh, that's what we're looking at. That's what you're looking at right now. That's what each of us is looking at right now is the pictures in our brains that our brains make out of sensory input. We don't have direct access to what's actually there that we could call the world. The world is mysterious. It's unknowable. All we have is our interpretations and our explanations and our pictures of what the world is. Another way to say it is all we have is our models of the world.
And going back now to the biocentrism concept, he's actually saying that there is no world, there is no external universe until it's observed. You're not going quite that far, from what I can tell.
Well, okay, again, we have to define terms.
Mhm.
What we call the world is instead a picture. It's an interpretation. But we're making a picture and an interpretation out of something which is unimaginably complex, unknowable, And we haven't brought up the issue of quantum mechanics yet, but it exists
Mhm.
in superposition. It exists as a multiplicity of possibilities, whatever it is. And as far as the physical universe, yes, we create the physicalness of the physical universe, but the word universe is a much broader word. It points, I think, to all that is, and there is all that is. Um, we haven't talked about consciousness yet either, and we should probably go there. But those two
Yeah, let's
things
delve into
converge.
that. Yeah, let's delve into that, and also kind of both of those concepts, the quantum mechanics piece and consciousness. Going back to what I presented in the introduction, in the quantum world, quantum entities are in what you just referred to as superposition until something happens to bring them out of that. And a superposition, of course, as I mentioned, is this state of being in every possible state of existence until something happens that brings along it's what they call decoherence, and then it snaps into a single real entity. And in quantum mechanics, that's absolutely been confirmed 1,000 times, if not more, in the laboratory that actually does happen. But what I'm kind of now wondering is, does that happen in the macro world that we're living in? Does is everything like you just mentioned? Does everything that's in the macro world, things like this microphone and my cell phone, the pen I'm holding, does it exist in a superposition until observed?
I think what you're talking about is that the world, until it's observed, exists in a superposition of possible uh, realities, and uh, the observer chooses one of those realities. How we do that is pretty mysterious. I don't think we could elucidate that in the time we have available. But the world is perceivable in vastly different ways, more numerable ways, more numerous ways than we perceive it. We only perceive one world typically, but one of the interpretations of quantum mechanics that you pointed out in your notes is the many worlds interpretation, which says that every possibility exists as a world, as a perceivable world. And there's a mechanism by which each observer chooses one of those possible worlds to experience. And if someone else, for example, is not choosing that particular world or isn't resonating with that particular frequency, introducing another concept, then you and I won't run into each other. We won't
Hmm.
encounter one another.
Yeah, that under the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, that's a fascinating way of looking at it. Let's kind of slip back to the tree falling in the forest. If everything is actually in this state of superposition before it's either observed or interacted with, etc., and let's say the owner of a cabin is riding out to his cabin and he sees that that tree that fell actually fell on his cabin. All right, it, he's gonna look, or maybe even slip it back a little further. One week he was there, the tree was standing. The next week it fell when he came back. How did that happen if there was no observation of the actual tree falling and it was in a superposition prior to that?
Well, we don't want to get too in the weeds here. Um, his interpretive mechanism allows him to create the object called the tree and the object called the cabin. And his interpretive mechanism is not likely to change unless he changes his belief system, until he changes the way he regards the world. So he's likely to see a consistent scenario where there's a tree, the tree falls, the tree hits the cabin.
Okay, and relate that, if you will, to consciousness itself. Is there something about his consciousness or consciousness in general that is doing this act of bringing things to life?
Sure. Think about the dream you had last night. let's say you were in a field and there was a tree in the dream you had last night. When you're dreaming, you create the experience of tree. You're probably not aware that you're creating it while you're dreaming, although that's possible. It's called a lucid dream. But that tree doesn't have an analog in any external physical world or physical universe. You're creating it. How we do that, I don't know. How does the brain create a picture? I don't know how it does that.
Yeah, but in the dream, the tree would only exist in my actual dream, in my consciousness of some sort as I'm sleeping and dreaming, whereas a tree in reality would exist separately, at least arguably separately, from my consciousness, right?
Uh, Here's the thing. What we have, Brian, is an interpretive mechanism by which visual data gets turned into a picture. We don't have access to anything outside of that interpretive mechanism, excuse me, and the interpretation itself. If you could get outside of it, then you could test it to see whether or not the picture in your head actually corresponds to something out there. But we can't do that. It's imagine you're wearing a virtual headset. The only way you could tell that what you're seeing in the virtual reality headset, the only way to tell that that's not doesn't have an analog in the external world is to take the headset off. And we
Hmm.
can't do that. That's a metaphor, obviously, but
Sure.
we have that built into ourselves. The headset creates vibrations, which our brains interpret as pictures, and they can be so compelling that you can react. Your body can react while you're looking at the picture that the headset uh, generates within your brain. But when you take the headset off, you could say, "Oh, that wasn't real." Well, we can't do that. This is all we
Hmm.
have.
Yeah, it's very interesting you point that out. One of the other scientists that I wanted to chat with you about in their work is Donald Hoffman. And I put that in the notes as well as something I wanted to chat about. He says that consciousness is all there is, and that space and time, consciousness is the fundamental grounding of reality, and that space and time is exactly what you just mentioned. It's effectively the equivalent of a virtual reality headset, and that we are interfacing with consciousness, pure consciousness, through that headset. Are you familiar with that work? And if so, or even if not, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I agree with that completely. Um,
Okay.
yeah, I agree with that. I really like what he said about releasing us from the dull worldview of life being merely the activity of an admixture of carbon and a few other elements. It suggests the exhilarating possibility that life is fundamentally immortal. I love that quote.
Yeah,
It's
it's a
like
really cool
we
quote.
are the creators of the world of our experience.
Yeah,
There is a universe. Go ahead.
he does have that whole concept of, like you said, you try and remove, if you remove space and time, you're removing the headset, you're removing the connection, if you will, to pure consciousness that we have. I think it's a fascinating concept. I'm not so sure I necessarily agree or disagree, but I think it's a really cool concept. And that quote that you mentioned is great. If consciousness, I mean, if consciousness is the underlying reality, if you will. How did that get there? Okay, I want to. I see a lot of this stuff, and one of the episodes I had on the show earlier about me elaborating on it is about, well, consciousness is the ground state. Okay, yeah, fine, but how did it get here? Where did it come from?
Well, there's an assumption implicit in your question that I think we should shine a light on. And that
Okay.
assumption is that consciousness is a thing. And our experience of things that they have origins, they have beginnings and endings. I would suggest that consciousness is not a thing. It's the container for all things. It always was, it is, and it always will be. And the mind is not equipped to create a picture, a mental picture of that. The mind is really good at creating mental pictures of things like objects or even invisible things like fields. The mind is pretty comfortable with the gravitational field, even though you can't see it, but it's still a thing. It's still something that can be differentiated from everything else. You can't do that with consciousness.
Are you saying basically then consciousness is something that simply always has existed? It doesn't, it's not subject to beginning or ending. It's always been there.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Okay. Fascinating. Yeah, I mean that's something that again I explored a little bit in that in the episode that I had previously. But how is it then that we experience it? I mean, you mentioned the mind, obviously. Donald Hoffman talks about that as well. Is the mind is just a something that taps into the greater consciousness, or is it something that is the source of consciousness somehow and it interplays in a different way?
That's not my cosmology. My cosmology is that consciousness, which is what we ultimately are, is eternal and everywhere. And the mind is a machine. It's essentially a record keeping machine. It creates multi-sensory records of successive moments of now, which accumulate in a stack. And thinking is using that machine to go through those earlier similar multi-sensory pictures, looking for hints about how to deal with what we're dealing with right now. That comes from a very old part of the brain. But the mind is a machine. The mind is not alive. It's a tool.
All right, so is it a tool though of accessing a greater field, if you will, or a greater existence of consciousness? Is that what
I
you're
don't think
thinking the mind is?
so. I don't think
Okay.
so, Brian. I think that our beingness, our human beingness in the world can access that broader field of intelligence. I once wrote about it as a solutions field. Um, I think we use the mind as a tool to do that, but there's more power. There is a more powerful tool that we have access to access that larger intelligence, and I call it intuition. I think
Okay.
intuition is a word that can be used to point to the ability to access a broader consciousness than what we would call our human consciousness.
You're saying that there's an intuition, but where does that come from? Where is that just something that we're endowed with somehow, or where? How does that? Isn't it part of your mind, your brain?
Well, I don't think so. Once again, I think
Okay.
that we are individuations or individualizations of consciousness. And we have access to that broader consciousness because it's what we really are. It's where we actually came from. And the difficulty in picturing that has to do with our commitment to the idea that we're separate.
Okay, so we're not
We're
separate
committed to the
beings.
idea that because our bodies are separate from one another and from the environment in our visual field of view, that we have to somehow communicate with something else that's out there someplace. And I think that's a projection. I think that's an idea which we have made real in our interpretive mechanism, but ultimately it's not real.
Okay, so the separateness that we all experience, the subjectivity effectively that we all experience, that you're saying that's not real, but rather it's we're all just part of one larger consciousness, but kind of sparks off of that, if you will. Is that kind of summing it up right?
Yeah, maybe your viewers can picture an aspen grove. I live in Colorado and there's lots of aspen groves around here. And we're used to seeing an aspen grove as like any other grove of trees, which is a bunch of trees. But an aspen grove can be seen as one organism, because if you dig up the root system, you see that they all come from the same root system. It's one organism. So we have metaphorically a bunch of dirt covering up our oneness, and what we see is the trees. What we see is apparently separate, but ultimately not.
Okay, so the appearance of separateness is an illusion, effectively, and the reality, the underlying reality, is a whole, and that if we didn't have the separateness, we would be able to experience it, but we can't because we are separate. Fair?
That's where I'm coming from.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's again a fascinating subject, similar to what I was mentioning, Donald Hoffman's concept, where he thinks that everything is consciousness. That's the reality, and that we are plugging into it through the headset of space and time. So I'm
Yeah.
fascinated by this whole concept. I do want to again invite everybody to go to your website, Larry. It's LarryGottlieb.com. Larry's an author of a couple of books, so check that out. Very important to do that. The Seer's Explanation and Hoodwinked. So go to that. And also go to our website. It's accessthepodquest.com. You'll be able to pick up not only this episode, but all the other episodes, of course, and then come back to YouTube and pick us up from here. But in the meantime, we're just going to take a bit of a break, and we're going to come right back with more with Larry Gottlieb. All right, welcome back to Access the Podquest. We're picking it back up with author Larry Gottlieb about the observer effect, both in quantum mechanics and outside in the macro world. Also, consciousness, separateness, all of these really exciting topics. So we're back. We're going to pick this back up right away, Larry. You had mentioned before we took our break that everything is you view it as everything that we see and everything we experience is separate, but that's really an illusion that is behind, or I'm sorry, in front of the underlying reality, which is a oneness, which is consciousness. And I've heard a lot about that, a lot about consciousness being the fundamental reality. All right, and that's where it's not what we see; it's consciousness. And I've seen a lot, not only in science stuff, but also religious traditions. And so I wanted to find out from you, do you know of any evidentiary basis for that? Is there any scientific or other evidence that we can point to that says that consciousness is fundamental?
Brian, the overall topic that we're talking about here is, what is a human being? And our culture teaches us that a human being is that a human being is an object which happens to have the property of self-awareness, or awareness of self. And we look at everything through that assumption. And that's what generates separation. It's what generates the difficulty in understanding quantum entanglement and a fact like, or an observation like, my wife and I frequently have the same thought at the same time. So how does that happen? Is it telepathy, or is it something more fundamental? Give me your question again. Let me see if I can hone in on it.
Yeah, basically the basic question is there any evidentiary support, evidentiary basis for saying that consciousness is the ground state of everything?
In order to have evidence in a scientific sense about the reality of some proposition, you have to be able to view that situation, that proposition, from outside of it. Again, we can't view human being from outside of human being, because that's all we are. That's what we are. And we don't have access to a larger context. So when you say, is there evidence for consciousness being everywhere? I would say yes, but only in the domain of experience. My experience has led me to be certain that consciousness is the bedrock, is the is the context in which everything, or the container in which everything else takes place. I could turn it around. I could turn that question around and say, what's the evidentiary basis for there being a physical world out there independent of his observation? You can't prove that either. All you have is your ability to observe and to process and interpret your observations. You can't get outside that whole mechanism to actually see that there is an external world.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. And I've given a lot of thought to it, of course, through the years. If you want to prove that the external world exists, you can do testing of various properties. You can take a look at my pen and break it all the way down and find out what it's made out of and all the rest of it. Um, but your point, I believe, is that we're doing the testing. We're doing the actual looking at this, and so we can't get out of our own space in order to determine whether or not it's actually something that exists. But that's kind of where I got that right when we started. I asked the question about the tree falling on the cabin. All right, and it's similar to this because it's like if you have a kitchen. Okay, I know Robert Lanza uses this example a lot. If you have a kitchen and you go to sleep at night, the machinery of the kitchen, he's saying it disappears, or you can't prove that it actually exists. But let's do this, okay, as a thought experiment. Okay, let's put on the kitchen counter a turkey Reuben sandwich. Okay, I always use a turkey Reuben sandwich. All right, and I told you I was going to. All right, and you go to bed. Okay, you have the turkey Reuben on the counter, and you go to bed. And at night, your dog or somehow you wake up and you go downstairs and you see that turkey Reuben sandwich. Someone took the very first bite of it. All right, a bite is missing. You know, we know that something in reality actually existed and something happened with that because there's a bite taken out of the turkey Reuben, right? So you can use that to say that there is an external world outside of somebody, outside you at least, experiencing it, right? Or am I barking up the wrong tree with the dog who took the bite of the sandwich?
Very good. Um, the turkey Reuben sandwich is the product of interpretation of electrical signals in the optic nerve. Or if you've tasted it, then it's the product of interpretation of electrical signals in whatever the mechanism that gets from your taste buds to your brain. You can't get outside of that. So yes, something took a bite out of that sandwich, okay. But to say that the sandwich is part of an external world that would still be there if all sentient creatures, all awareness were to disappear from the planet, I don't think you can do that.
Well, yeah. I mean, from a straight top down view, that obviously is true because if there was no living creatures, no one would be able to take the very first bite of that turkey Reuben. However, the fact that it was you went to sleep, it was intact. The next day you wake up and there's a bite taken out of it does suggest to me, at least pretty strongly, that there is an external world. There's a turkey Reuben. It exists, and something bit it while you were sleeping, and you weren't able to observe it. At least something was out there. Maybe that's the point. It could be that it's more than just you, but it seems to me that's got some validity to it.
Well, okay. I mean, I don't know how better I can argue that point. All I'm saying is that what we think of as the world is the result of an interpretive process of something that is ultimately unknown and unknowable and magical and mysterious. And by the way, one of the richest experiences of the world that we humans can have is of magic and mystery. And if you try to hammer everything that you observe into some coherent scheme so that you understand the entirety of the world that you're experiencing, I promise you, you will lose that magic and mystery, and life will become what did Hoffman say? or was it Lanza? Dull. I'm not finding it here.
Yeah, I think the quote you're looking for was from Donald Hoffman, right?
Yeah, the dull worldview of life, merely being an admixture of carbon. I mean, life is much more than trying to put together a bulletproof explanation of how the world works and what it is. Life's more than that. And I can't argue with you any further about your turkey Reuben, other than to say that everything you're talking about, the Reuben, the kitchen counter, the dog, the bed that you're sleeping in, is part of an it's a description. It's a picture in your brain, or a series of pictures in your brain that we can't demonstrate has any reality in anything that's external to us. Let me put it a different way. I'm saying that we are consciousness, and that consciousness is all there is. There's nothing outside of consciousness. So there is no external world external to consciousness. You can't get outside of consciousness.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
All
And
we
you
have
had
is our
mentioned,
interpretations.
okay, yeah, you had mentioned that that everything that we view and everything, the turkey Reuben, everything else is an illusion. And I think you also mentioned something about, there are other illusions that and I know that in your book Hoodwinked you talk about that. Maybe an expansion a little bit on that subject would be nice. What do you have about additional illusions that we have?
Well, I would say that our understanding of who we are and of the world we live in is rife with illusions. So there are profound illusions, and there are much less profound illusions. One example of the latter is you come over the crest of a hill, you're driving along the road, and you see what looks like a giant puddle on the road. It's not actually a puddle. It's a mirage. The light that enters your eyes fool your brain into thinking that there's a puddle of water there. But when you get closer, it's a dry pavement. It was an illusion. So that's a simple, I would say, secondary illusion. A primary illusion is the idea that there is, for example, an external world out there that would be there if nobody were around to perceive it, or that we're actually separate beings, whereas in reality, we are all one. Um, Another one is that time is fundamental, so that it's legitimate to ask a question like, when did the world come into being? And my statement would be, the world comes into being moment by moment as we observe it, as we interpret whatever it is, the vibrational frequencies that we're interpreting. Um, Another one would be one that you mentioned earlier, that what's the source of consciousness? Well, for consciousness to have a source, it has to be bounded. It has to have limitations so that you can distinguish it from everything else. And what I'm saying is, you can't do that with consciousness. Consciousness is the everything else. So those are
So
some examples of profound illusions. And I think we have been hoodwinked by our culture into believing in those illusions. And because we're not seeing the world as it really is, we make all kinds of mistakes. And the world looks like we're making all kinds of mistakes. It looks that way to me.
how can that be corrected? If that's the case, we're all, kind of getting pulled into these illusions, and it's not really seeing reality the way it is. How do we fix that? How can that be addressed?
Well, each human being can embark upon a voyage, as it were, of self-discovery, and identifying and releasing the illusions that we find in our own lives. An illusion like, I'm not good enough, or like, I'm not equipped to do that, or there are people who are so much more equipped to do that than I am, or there isn't enough to go around, or any of that stuff. Uh, so an individual human being can engage in that kind of process whereby you clarify your own view of the world. As far as what we know as the world, the world that has 8 billion of us in it, um, I think it's a generational thing. I think that, I have 3 grandsons, and they are unlike anybody I knew when I was that age. They are better equipped to deal with the world as creators than I ever was. I'm almost 80 years old. It's taken me most of that 80 years to begin to get a handle on how to live a satisfying, happy life. And I'm very appreciative of the fact that I've gained some tools to do that. But these kids, to me, seem like they're well beyond that. And it's real frustrating for us parents and grandparents because we think we know how to raise them. We think we know how they ought to behave. And that doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, that as the parent of two myself, I certainly hear what you're saying, and they're more equipped to handle a lot of things. I usually like to say, like especially with technology, I like to say, look, if you have a problem with your computer and it's a really bad one, you can either bring in a graduate from MIT, or if it's really really bad, then an 11-year-old. Okay,
Yeah.
so and they're more equipped in that way. But also, what you're saying is fascinating too. I wanted to go back real quick because those are great points about the different types of illusions, and if that's the case, maybe the answer to and maybe the answer to how do you fix that is maybe you don't because of what you also said, which is you want some mystery in the world. You want some magic still left, and I wanted to touch on based on your point. Something that I referenced to a friend recently, which is what I like to look at as the magic that already is. All right, and this goes back to quantum mechanics. I know you wanted to talk a little bit more about that too, in at least in some part. If you look at it and you look at what we are around, what we are surrounded by, we're surrounded by magic and magical or mysterious things that actually we know are true, but they're still magical in a way. Like for instance, the superposition concept you talked about earlier. Isn't that a form basically of magic? I mean, even at the quantum mechanical level, if you break everything down to its subatomic particles, they don't even exist until something interacts with them or they get observed, and then bam, they pop into existence. What do you think?
That's magical. I agree with you completely. And
Yeah,
living in the willingness to see the world as a magical, mysterious place is enlivening.
yeah,
I
I agree.
experience it as enlivening, as opposed to the word dull that Hoffman used.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I also, I mean, if you think of another one, throw a few examples out here, right? The Big Bang Theory itself, as I've learned recently through an interview with none other than Ethan Siegel, it really wasn't the Big Bang at first. It was the inflation, cosmic inflation. But nevertheless, it was everything was condensed into the smallest speck, almost basically nothing, a subatomic particle, and then bam, it explodes or inflates, and now we have a real world. How magical is that? How we don't we even if we say it happened, which I'm not sure if it did or not because that's still subject to the debate. But let's say it did, isn't that another piece of extraordinary magic?
I think there's magic. I agree with you. And I think there's magic everywhere. If you stand in the idea that the world exists in superposition until it's observed, I think one of the magical things is that you and I can agree on what we're observing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a great point. Now, and if you wind back to the point of consciousness you mentioned, we clearly have a shared consciousness, right? Because go back to the turkey Reuben. We're at a restaurant. I order a turkey Reuben. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not like you're thinking I ordered something really unusual. You know that, and you could say, well, you know what? I'll have a turkey Reuben as well. So we're sharing the same consciousness, right?
We are sharing the same consciousness. I would even say we are expressions of that consciousness. Because even when you say I hate to beat this into a pulp, but even when you say we're sharing the same consciousness, it sounds like consciousness is a thing that we're sharing because our minds are used to talking about things that we share, like like a meal and or we're sharing a car. You know, you drive it, then you park it, and I drive it. It's a thing. Consciousness isn't a thing. Nonetheless, not to get too involved in that. We share the same consciousness, but let me bring up, you talk about a turkey Reuben. Let's say some African tribesman appears in the restaurant and sits down at our table, and he puts something on the table that neither you nor I has ever seen, and he uses a word to point to that thing that we've never heard. Well, we're sharing the experience of being mystified as to what he's just put on the table, but it's a little different from your turkey Reuben in that I don't know exactly what it is. I don't know where it came from. I don't know what it's made of. I don't know what it's going to taste like, and I'm not at all sure I want any.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there are obviously differences and that could be introduced into that subject. A great point. We were talking about you're talking about the mixture of consciousness and quantum physics and all this stuff that we're kind of throwing about in different directions. What's interesting is that if you combine the kind of concepts, the problem I get where I come up against a problem is bridging the gap between that which applies to the quantum world and consciousness as it applies there, and then when you get to the larger world, which is like I said, all this magical stuff is really all these. And I had another episode entitled "The Strangeness Problem," which touches on most or many of these things. But all these things are really crazy, except one thing that's not crazy, and that is our experience of everything. Again, we could be at the same restaurant. Even if the gentleman from Africa is there with us, we all at least know that he's there, and we can all agree upon that he's sitting at a table. We're all doing our experience is all extremely understandable, but everything else surrounding us isn't, and that's where consciousness maybe is the bridge there. I don't know. I have that problem. Like I'll give you an example. One other point. I know you're waiting for this because I pointed it out in the notes. Right, the double slit experiment in quantum physics that I explained in the introduction. One photon, all right, if it's not observed, can go through both slits at the same time. In fact, it does go through both slits at the same time. Magical, right? But here, let's say I'm sitting here and I run towards a wall and there are two doors. Okay, there? Two doors, and no one's watching me. I'm not going through both doors at the same time, right? I mean, there's no way that happens. I am going to go through one door or the other, regardless if there's an observer there or not. So there's a massive difference between the macro world and the micro world, right? I'm made up of a bunch of electrons and neutrons and protons, etc., all of which go through both slits at the same time. But I don't. How? I mean, that has been something just absolutely fascinating to me. What do you have to say?
What if there's another world of the many worlds in which you went through the other door?
Okay.
What if
Well,
there's another
yeah,
Brian that went through the other door? And because of your commitment to separation, you don't have access to the experience of the other Brian.
okay. Great question. I don't know. I mean, I resist it because naturally my natural resistance is, well, there's no evidence of another world. Okay. I mean, we know that there's theoretical ideas about multiverse and also the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics at the subatomic level, but there's no evidence of it. It just seems to me that we've created that. At least that concept or those concepts in order to explain things that we can't quite understand. At the quantum level, we don't understand the superposition concept and decoherence, so we've come up with the many worlds interpretation. And the multiverse situation at the larger level, we don't understand how the Big Bang can have led to something that is so finely tuned for life that we've now come up with the multiverse idea. So I resist it, but I hear what you're saying. It's a fascinating point. If there are two me's out there and one of them's running through one door and one's running through the other, then that's adequate. But I just don't see there's any evidence for that.
I understand. I think for me, the problem is that we are looking at the world through a mind that's not equipped to deal with infinity. It's not equipped
Mm.
to deal with all possibility. It's only equipped to deal with, well, ultimately, it's only equipped to deal with situations that are either going to elicit fight or flight or freeze or something like that. In other words, our interpretive mechanisms are designed in from I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago to make those kinds of distinctions. We have not evolved minds that are capable of appreciating uh, infinite possibility or even
Yeah.
possibilities that we don't see with our physical eyes. So we make models of something that's infinite, that's without limit, which is what infinite means. We're all we can do is make models, finite models out of something that's not finite. And then we get frustrated because our models don't answer all the questions that we have. And instead, if we could release the compulsion to make these finite models of something that's not finite and just appreciate the magic and the mystery of the world that we live in, I believe we would be happier. In fact, that's been my
Fantastic point.
experience.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's been an absolutely extraordinary conversation, Larry. Very much enjoyed it. Everyone go to LarryGottlieb.com to check out more about Mr. Gottlieb's fabulous ideas. Also, come back to YouTube and like our channel, like this video, subscribe to the channel, go to accessthepodquest.com, all of that stuff. You go there, and we will be going ever forward.